Good morning, everybody, and it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here today. It's wonderful to see all of you, the founders and organizers of DRIIV in Delhi and the Swedish delegation. And I think, as we've heard so far, there's a lot to do and take off now that the organization is really well in place. One of the very interesting things about our best institutions in India, it used to be said, is the IITs, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, the Indian Institute of Science, all of them had a common characteristic in that they were said to be a short walk from India, in the sense that they are extraordinary institutions, but they were not sufficiently connected with problems in our ecosystem. As Ram Gopal Rao very rightly said, they were superb at knowledge generation, but unless there's a rootedness and a connectedness, true innovation doesn't happen on scale. You become very good at understanding what is happening all over the world, and you can at best be really top-class emulators, even if you're not imitating, but you're not going to have originality. That has changed dramatically over the last few years, 5 to 10 years, I would say, and there are important internal as well as external reasons for that. Let me quickly go through what those kinds of reasons are, and then what I will basically run through very rapidly is to state what the important problems of our times are, what the ways we can address those problems, the mechanisms, and then how local and international collaborations are important for that. How do we find the resources for tackling these problems? And what are the benefits, local, national, and international, in the context of important challenges such as we face in terms of climate change? What are the problems which we face today? And those problems have suddenly moved from being problems which we define and want to address to becoming planetary problems. Let me give you one example. When agriculture, when the domestication of plants and animals started on scale 10,000 years ago, typically agriculture involved the burning of forests and tilling of land for growing plants. And soon the erosion of soil properties and the need for higher yield required fertilizers. Those fertilizers were typically bird droppings, guano, which came in Europe from South America and from China. So when those droppings ran out, there was a great tension that fertilizers would not be available, but nitrite mines, again from South America and from China, provided a source of fertilizer. When that started running out, it would have been a disaster because populations were growing proportionate to the availability of food, and food was cultivable on scale because of fertilizers being available. Then two groups of German scientists, led by Fritz Haber and Bosch, invented the Haber-Bosch process to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere and make ammonia, and that led to the development of ammonical fertilizers. It also, as a corollary, led to the development of chemicals which were used very sadly in chemical warfare. That's another story. But that story is very interesting because it eventually led, the development of fertilizers that is, led to unlimited, essentially, growth of agriculture. Today, half the nitrogen in our bodies comes from the Haber-Bosch process, right? So this is an incredible change. But this was the approach which humans started taking through the industrial revolutions. They seemed to be able to surmount every problem which they faced or created by innovation, ingenuity, and technology. Little did they realize at that time that they were really developing technologies whose costs, whose benefits were enormous for immediately for the generations, but whose costs had to be met by future generations. So there were extraordinary inventions. The chainsaw is an extraordinary invention. It allowed you to fell forests with great speed and use wood for all sorts of things. but it caused disasters ecologically. The deep sea fishing trawlers, similarly, were extraordinary. And you could fish on scale and feed people on a huge scale, but it depleted the oceans. The costs of this depletion of the oceans or the forests or ecological problems were paid by future generations. So this habit economically of having high quality, high standard of living as a consequence of innovation in technology, but asking future generations to pay for it can only go so far. Now it is not a question of human ingenuity alone. The planet is at extraordinary peril because you have eaten up into the planet on a scale in such a manner that ingenuity alone cannot save it. It requires a focus on the commons and a collectivization. Because all of this development which we saw previously had another important characteristic. It defined the other and it defined yourself, and your progress had to be done at the cost of the other. The other could be markets, it could be fuel, it could be your working force, it could be, export markets, and so on and so forth. But the moment you remove the definition of the other and you say the whole world is one unit, then you are in a big challenge in thermodynamics. You cannot use energy to get order in one place at the cost of disorder outside. How do you have enough energy to have order in the entire planet? That's the current challenge right now. The fact of the matter is there's no going back into some nativist past and addressing these issues. We have to go to the future. We have a planet which is at a certain state. How do we go about it? Now, the problems, therefore, are environment, ecology, sustainable development, and really preserving the future of the planet entirely, in its entirety, not just about humans. Now, these problems are well stated now. Many people are discussing it, and they have been well documented. But I think one very important point we should keep in mind is to distinguish between answers to questions and solutions to problems. And we tend too much to focus on the answers to questions, which are easy to give. There is climate change, what do we do? Well, address mitigation and adaptation. Now, that's an answer. The solution is much more complex. How much do you actually cut back on fossil fuels? Do you do the same thing for every economy? How do you do it differently for different economies? Can renewable energy be sufficient in different contexts? How do you, deal with the requirement for sustainable development and the change in your energy profile? These are going to be messy and take time, but we need to act very speedily. So solutions are more complex than answers. So we need to look at mechanisms then to implement these solutions. And there, coming back to my point about our institutional structures in the country, and these silos of high-quality institutions are not just a characteristic of India, but in many ways, they are a reflection of the characteristic of the world. Countries, cities, and institutions in different countries were also silos in different ways. So the solutions we have today require us to come together in a very organic manner. Now, this has been said hundreds of times, but it hasn't happened easily. It happens relatively easier during a crisis, as we saw during the COVID pandemic. People came together a lot more. But the moment the crisis goes away, people go back to their old ways. This happened in 1918 after the flu pandemic, and it happened fictitiously in a movie which I don't know whether you've seen recently. It says, I think the title is Don't Look Up, when there's an asteroid about to crash on the Earth, but people are more concerned about their day-to-day problems. So this tendency to be concerned with the immediate and the urgent rather than the important is a very big challenge, particularly in capital cities across the world where the urgent takes on a very regular activity. So in that situation, what DRIIV is doing, this consortium of all the institutions in the National Capital Region, is very important. In the National Capital Region, and let's take, for example, South Delhi. If you start from the University of Delhi's South Campus, go to the Jawaharlal Nehru Institute, the Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Delhi, the Indian Statistical Institute, the institutes of the Department of Biotechnology, the National Physical Laboratory and the CSR institutes, and the All India Institute of Medical Science and Safdarjung Hospital. It's an extraordinary powerhouse. And these people working together, along with other institutions, can do wonders. In Sweden, we have had examples of this happening. In the Karolinska biocluster, other bioclusters, other clusters in Sweden, and they've really come together a lot. And the driving force for that is a combination of an appreciation of problems, but more fundamentally, the mechanism of success of each of these institutions, essentially their survival, the survival of their faculty lies in working together. So in other words, you're pretty much thrown into the deep end of the pool, and unless you work together, both because of top-down mechanisms of funding and bottom-up because of the opportunities, you can't get anything done. So in that context, the way by which the clusters have come together are very good. Many of you have, said how important the PSA's office's role was in setting up these clusters, but it's critical to remember that while government can keep nudging and suggesting these kinds of roles, unless these take on an organic feedback, sustainable mechanism, which is independent of government, this is not going to take off on scale, the kind of scale which is needed. So in some ways, becoming completely independent and making government irrelevant in the growth of the clusters is critically important. Now that can happen only if the kinds of problems and solutions you take are very, very attractive. I mentioned two words, mitigation and adaptation. And pretty much everything the clusters do, and particularly this one, will have to address one or the other. Can you look at new ways of, capturing energy, carbon capture and utilization, cleaner fuels of various kinds? Global temperatures are rising, and with increased humidity and increased wet bulb temperatures, it's going to be a major disaster. So what about adaptation, which, in terms of, economies, that's going to be a really terrific opportunity for startups to address adaptation in various ways, and that can be done. The benefits of this will accrue only if there's extraordinary national and international collaboration. And that national collaboration has to go beyond the clusters into the college and university system, both in the Delhi region and elsewhere. There's a great opportunity there. India should leverage its strengths, and those strengths include both the hard-nosed understanding of every kind of technology and, the physical aspects of it, but also the cyber aspects and linking that. That capacity to do it on scale is something which India can and must bring to the table. Unless there's international collaboration, this is not going to take off substantially, and therefore it's particularly good to see this collaboration with Sweden. Sweden has been at the forefront of these kinds of issues, which I talked about for many years now. I think the first major global conference on the environment was in Sweden in the early 1970s. And that's when the whole idea about the environment being a factor came in, and India was participant in that. So these kinds of issues now need to have taken on a very hard reality, which we must address in very important ways. Now, where will the resources for all this come from? There is a tendency which we had some years ago, which we don't have now, and I congratulate the Delhi cluster for being innovative there, and the CEO, Ms. Shipra Mishra, for that, is that we expect government support for doing all these big projects. I think the government support has been extraordinary in allowing the development of institutions. But today, if the way the institutions have come up with their extraordinary infrastructure, partnering with smaller institutions which don't have that infrastructure but which have flexibility, our colleges, our state universities, our private universities, in a manner where these resources can be used to address innovative problems and collaborate internationally, brings in a level of flexibility which the government system alone doesn't have, but also resources. And industry will also put in resources as long as they see a trust in the ecosystem. And that trust can come by quality leadership. And when IIT Delhi puts its brand behind it and brings together all the institutions in this area, and there's national and international collaboration, I think resources will not be wanting. And all of us here and outside will put our shoulders to the wheel and make sure that the resources come. So I think there's a great future. There's always a early lag and a late lag phase, and I think we're going through the late lag phase, and now DRIIV is ready for exponential takeoff, and I'm sure that will happen very soon. Thank you very much.